Good Economics for Hard Times by Abhijit V. Banerjee and Esther Duflo. Picture this. A woman visits her doctor and receives devastating news. "I'm afraid you only have 6 months to live," he tells her. She's stunned, searching for any glimmer of hope. Then the doctor offers an odd suggestion. Marry an economist and move to South Dakota. Her eyes light up. "Will that cure me?" "No," he replies with a slight smile, "but it'll make those 6 months feel awfully long." This joke opens a book that earned its authors, Abhijit V. Banerjee and Esther Duflo, the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2019. And honestly, it perfectly captures how most of us feel about economics. Dismal, complicated, about as exciting as watching paint dry. We imagine it as the domain of experts in expensive suits, speaking an incomprehensible language while making grand predictions that rarely come true. For years, we've just accepted this reality. We've watched economics become a weapon in political warfare, reduced to bumper sticker slogans shouted on cable news: "Free trade is good," "Immigrants steal jobs," "Taxes destroy growth." But here's the thing. What if most of what you think you know about economics is completely wrong? Not just slightly off, but fundamentally built on a misunderstanding of how people and the world actually work? The book we're exploring today, Good Economics for Hard Times, is something of a quiet revolution. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies worldwide, not because it offers easy answers, but because it does something far more radical. It pulls back the curtain on the world's most explosive issues: immigration, trade, inequality, climate change, and the future of work, and reveals that the truth is far more complex and, surprisingly, far more hopeful than the headlines suggest. Banerjee and Duflo aren't your stereotypical economists. They didn't spend their careers in corporate boardrooms. Instead, they worked in villages and slums across the world's poorest countries, getting their hands dirty trying to understand real people living real lives. They describe themselves as more like plumbers than physicists. They don't claim to have a grand theory explaining everything, but they're pretty good at finding leaks and figuring out how to fix them. In this book, they bring that same practical, boots-on-the-ground wisdom to the biggest challenges facing the wealthiest nations on Earth. So here's my promise. By the end of this journey, you'll see the world through fresh eyes. You'll understand that those angry debates you see on television are built on myths. You'll discover that economics, when done right, isn't really about money or mathematical models at all. It's about dignity, hope, and building a more humane world. And you'll realize that the most powerful tool we have for solving our hardest problems isn't some new policy or breakthrough technology, but simply a new way of thinking. Let's dive in. To grasp the heart of Good Economics for Hard Times, we need to start with a puzzle. It's a puzzle that explains nearly everything, from our fear of immigration to the devastation of trade wars. And it goes like this. Why do so many people stay put, even when a better life seems just a bus ride away? Economics 101 sells us a seductive story. It says people are like water, always flowing toward opportunity. If wages are higher in the city, people will naturally pack up and move. If a factory shuts down in Ohio, workers will relocate to booming Texas. This vision of a fluid, dynamic world underpins almost every economic policy we have. But as Banerjee and Duflo reveal, it's pure fantasy. The real world isn't fluid at all. It's sticky. Once you understand just how profoundly sticky our world is, those angry, polarized debates suddenly make a whole lot more sense. Let's start with one of the most explosive issues: immigration. The narrative we hear constantly is one of invasion. Hordes of desperate people from poor countries flooding into wealthy nations, stealing jobs and crushing wages. President Trump captured this anxiety perfectly when he declared the country is full. The logic seems ironclad: basic supply and demand, more workers equals lower wages for everyone. You could sketch it on a napkin. But the authors challenge us to look closer, because that simple picture is spectacularly wrong. First, they share the haunting poetry of Warsan Shire, who wrote, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." People don't uproot their entire lives for a few extra dollars. They migrate to escape catastrophe. Drug wars, civil wars, the complete collapse of anything resembling normal life. The people most desperate to leave places like Syria or Guatemala aren't from the world's poorest countries. They're from places where life has become unbearable. Here's the real puzzle, the authors argue. It's not why so many people move, but why so few do. Even within the same country, where there are no borders or visa requirements, massive wage gaps exist between cities and rural areas. Yet millions choose to stay in their villages. During Greece's economic crisis, when unemployment hit 27%, fewer than 3% of Greeks left the country, even though as EU citizens they could have freely moved anywhere in Europe to find work. Something holds us back, and it's not ignorance. In a remarkable experiment in Bangladesh, researchers offered desperately poor rural families a small amount of cash, just enough for a bus ticket and a few days of food, to encourage them to migrate to the city during Monga, the season of hunger. Those who accepted the offer ended up earning far more than they ever could at home. Their families went from near starvation to eating comfortably. Yet when the next lean season arrived, only about half chose to go back. Even with first-hand proof of the benefits, the pull of home was incredibly powerful. It often takes catastrophe to shake people loose. In 1973, a volcano erupted off Iceland's coast, destroying about a third of the homes in a prosperous fishing community. Those whose houses were destroyed received cash and the freedom to move anywhere. Decades later, researchers discovered something fascinating. The children from families whose homes were destroyed ended up earning significantly more over their lifetimes. Being forced to move broke the cycle, pushing them away from the fisherman's life their families had followed for generations toward college and different careers. They were shaken loose from their sticky existence. This stickiness, our attachment to home, family, community, and our deep fear of the unknown, is the first crack in that simple story about immigration. The hordes aren't coming. Most people desperately want to stay home. But what about those who do come? Do they really drive down wages? The most famous study examined a unique moment in American history, the Mariel boat lift. In 1980, Fidel Castro suddenly announced that any Cuban who wanted to leave could do so. Within months, 125,000 Cubans, mostly low-skilled workers, arrived in Miami, increasing the city's labor force by 7% practically overnight. According to simple supply and demand logic, Miami's wages should have collapsed. So what actually happened? Nothing. Economist David Card compared Miami's wage and employment trends to similar cities and found zero negative effect. Even the wages of earlier Cuban immigrants, who should have been the most direct competitors, remained unaffected. The study sparked heated debate that continues today, but its central finding has been confirmed repeatedly in different contexts, from Algerian repatriates in France to Soviet Jews in Israel. The overwhelming consensus among economists, summarized by the prestigious National Academy of Sciences, is that over the long run, immigration's impact on native-born workers' wages is, quote, very small. Why does that simple napkin drawing fail so spectacularly? Because it leaves out the most important parts of the story. First, immigrants aren't just workers. They're also consumers. They rent apartments, get haircuts, buy groceries. This creates new jobs, often for other low-skilled workers, shifting labor demand at the same time supply shifts. Second, immigrants often complement native workers rather than competing with them. They take jobs natives are reluctant to do, mowing lawns, flipping burgers, caring for the elderly. This frees native workers to move into more complex, better-paying roles, requiring communication skills and local knowledge. When low-skilled immigrants arrive, native workers often get promoted. Third, labor isn't like produce at a farmer's market. Employers can't just hire the cheapest person who walks through the door. They worry about reliability, skill, and trust. Existing workers have a huge advantage because they're known quantities. This creates natural protection for native workers, making it much harder for newcomers to undercut them on wages. The simple, scary story about immigration crumbles under the weight of evidence. It's born from misunderstanding both human nature and economics. The real migration crisis isn't too many people on the move. It's too few. The world is far stickier than we imagine, and that stickiness has profound consequences, not just for immigration, but for the second great pillar of globalization, international trade. If there's one idea uniting nearly all economists, it's that free trade benefits everyone. The logic, first outlined by David Ricardo 200 years ago, is elegantly simple: the theory of comparative advantage. Even if one country, say China, is better at producing everything, it still makes sense for countries to specialize in what they're relatively best at and trade with each other. This way, everyone becomes more productive, the total economic pie grows, and theoretically, everyone wins. This idea is so powerful it's become near dogma. But the general public has never fully bought it. They see cheap goods at Walmart, sure, but they also see shuttered factories and lost jobs. They see the gains but feel the pain. So who's right? The economists, with their elegant theories, or the people experiencing reality on the ground? The authors argue the public has intuited something many economists missed. The beautiful theory of trade has a dark side, emerging from that same force we just discussed: stickiness. The classic theory, known as the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, makes a clear prediction. When a rich country like the United States trades with a poorer, labor-abundant country like China, American workers should see wages fall, while Chinese workers' wages rise. The theory acknowledges there will be losers in rich countries, but promises the overall gains will be so large that winners could easily compensate losers, making everyone better off. The problem, as the authors put it, is that's a very big if. The compensation rarely happens. But there's an even deeper problem. The theory often doesn't even get the first part right. When developing countries like Mexico, Brazil, and India opened up to trade, theory predicted inequality should fall as low-skilled workers benefited. Instead, in almost every case, inequality exploded. What went wrong? The answer came from groundbreaking research by economist Pitya Topolova, then a PhD student. She studied India's massive trade liberalization in 1991. Instead of looking at the country as a whole, she examined how different districts were exposed to foreign competition based on their local industries. Her findings were shocking and deeply controversial. In districts most exposed to trade, poverty fell more slowly than in the rest of the country. Trade's promise to lift the poor wasn't just failing to materialize, it seemed to be working in reverse. Her research contradicted established dogma so thoroughly that it met hostility from the economics profession. Top journals rejected her paper. It took years for recognition, but it eventually inspired a wave of research finding similar results worldwide, most famously in the United States. This research uncovered the truth about trade, the theoretical gains from reallocating workers from failing industries to rising ones simply weren't happening. The economy was too sticky. When factories closed, workers didn't move to new towns or retrain for new careers. They stayed put. Capital didn't flow smoothly from dying sectors to booming ones. The result wasn't dynamic reshuffling, but slow, painful decay. This phenomenon was most famously documented in the United States as the quote, China shock. Starting around the 1990s, an explosion of cheap Chinese imports hammered American manufacturing with incredible force. Researchers David Autor, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson used Topolova's method to map the impact. In communities most exposed to Chinese competition, manufacturing employment collapsed, and just like in India, there was no reallocation to new jobs. In fact, total employment often fell by more than just manufacturing losses. As local economies spiraled downward, wages fell. People didn't move away, they just got stuck. The government did remarkably little to help. The flagship program designed to help workers hurt by trade adjustment assistance, or TAA, was minuscule. For every $549 in lost income per adult in the hardest-hit areas, government assistance increased by only $58. Most of that came as disability insurance, a one-way ticket out of the workforce that strips people of dignity. The elegant theory of trade crashed against the hard reality of a sticky world. Those smooth transitions economists assumed would happen were anything but. They were brutal, prolonged, and left deep scars on entire communities. And here's the most shocking part. The aggregate gains from trade for a massive, diverse economy like the United States are actually quite small. One study estimated that if the U.S. stopped trading with the world entirely, its economy would shrink by only about 2.5% of GDP. That's roughly 1 year of decent growth. For decades, we pursued a policy delivering immense, concentrated pain for surprisingly small overall gain. We did this because we were gripped by a powerful but flawed idea, an idea that ignored the stickiness of the world, and in doing so, ignored the dignity of the people getting stuck. This brings us to the deepest, most challenging part of the book. The debates over immigration and trade aren't just about economics. They're about something far more fundamental: our identity, our beliefs, our very preferences. Why have these economic shocks led to such surging polarization, anger, and what feels like raw, tribal hatred? For a long time, economists avoided this messy territory. A famous 1977 paper argued, De gustibus non est disputandum, Latin for, there is no accounting for tastes. The idea was that economists should take people's preferences as given. We can't say someone's preference for vanilla over chocolate is wrong, and by extension, we can't judge their preference for people who look like them over people who don't. But the authors argue this hands-off approach is no longer tenable. Our preferences aren't stable, fixed things we're born with. They're shaped profoundly by context, history, and the stories we tell ourselves. Consider the famous Robbers Cave experiment from the 1950s. Young boys at summer camp were randomly divided into two groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers. Initially, they didn't know the other group existed. But once introduced and made to compete in games, fierce rivalry quickly developed, filled with name-calling and hostility. Then, researchers created a common problem: a water shortage requiring both groups to work together. Just as quickly as it formed, the animosity began dissolving as they worked toward a shared goal. This experiment reveals a fundamental truth about human nature. It's frighteningly easy to create an us and a them. But it's also possible to bring people back together. Our identities aren't set in stone. This is why simple facts often fail to change minds about charged issues like immigration. When confronted with facts challenging our group's beliefs, our first instinct isn't to update our view, but to protect our identity. This is why calling people racist or deplorables is so counterproductive. It attacks their moral sense of self, and they immediately shut down. Our beliefs connect deeply to our self-esteem. An amazing experiment demonstrated the power of what psychologists call stereotype threat. Black students performed just as well as white students on a test described as a simple, problem-solving task. But when told the same test measured intellectual ability, their scores plummeted. Simply reminding them of a negative stereotype was enough to make it self-fulfilling. This happens to everyone. White male engineering students did worse on a math test when told it was designed to figure out why Asians excel at math. We constantly, unconsciously absorb and perform the stereotypes around us. In a segregated world, these stereotypes become dangerously powerful. We live in echo chambers, surrounded by people who think just like us. Social media, once promised as a tool to connect us all, has largely reinforced these divisions. Politically engaged liberals on Twitter get 92% of their information from other liberal sources. For conservatives, it's 93% from conservative sources. We're not having a conversation. We're shouting into separate rooms. This profound disconnection lies at the heart of our hard times. The economic shocks of trade and technology didn't just cost people jobs. For many, it cost their sense of place and dignity. In a world that tells them they live in a land of opportunity where anyone can succeed, the inability to do so creates a terrible choice. Blame yourself, leading to despair, or blame someone else. This is where we find ourselves today. The rise in deaths of despair from suicide, drug overdoses, and alcoholism among middle-aged white Americans without college degrees is a terrifying symptom of this crisis. It's been building for decades, the result of a particular kind of economic growth that left millions behind. Since the 1980s, under the influence of what became known as Reaganomics, America's social contract was rewritten. The idea was simple: cut taxes on the rich, dismantle unions, deregulate business, and the resulting economic growth would eventually trickle down to everyone else. Well, the growth never really roared back to post-war levels. But one thing did happen. Inequality exploded. Since 1980, the share of national income going to the top 1% of Americans has nearly tripled, returning to the giddy levels of the Roaring '20s right before the Great Depression. Meanwhile, for the bottom half, incomes completely stagnated. For a full-time male worker with only a high school degree, his real weekly earnings in 2018 were about 20% lower than in 1980. All the gains from 40 years of economic growth were vacuumed up by those at the very top. How did this happen? It wasn't just robots or globalization. Technology and trade have been happening everywhere. But this dramatic rise in inequality is a uniquely Anglo-American story. In continental European countries like France and Denmark, inequality fell after World War II and stayed low. The difference was policy, specifically dramatically slashing taxes on the very rich. In the 1950s, under a Republican president, the top marginal income tax rate in the U.S. exceeded 90%. The point wasn't to raise tons of money. Almost no one paid it. But to send a clear social signal that astronomical incomes were simply unacceptable. It acted as a powerful brake on runaway executive pay. When those top rates were slashed, the brake released, and top incomes shot into the stratosphere. This was justified by claiming we need massive incentives for the rich to work hard and innovate. But the evidence simply doesn't support this. The rich don't stop working when taxes rise. Their effort is driven by competition, status, and the desire to win. Just like professional athletes who play their hearts out whether they're paid $10 million or $20 million. High taxes on the ultra-rich don't kill growth, but they do curb the worst excesses of inequality. This brings us to the final crucial part of the author's argument. What's the way out of these hard times? The answer isn't trying to turn back the clock on globalization or technology. The answer is building a better social safety net, but not the kind we have now. Our current system is a tangled mess of programs that are often complicated, stigmatizing, and deeply disrespectful to the people they're supposed to help. Applying for benefits can be a bureaucratic nightmare that defeats the very people who need it most. The whole system is built on suspicion, the fear that if we give poor people cash, they'll stop working or waste it on alcohol and tobacco. This fear is one of the most persistent and damaging myths in all of public policy. The authors, who've been at the forefront of studying cash transfers worldwide, show the evidence is overwhelming. When you give poor people cash, they don't stop working. They don't drink it away. They spend it on food for their children, school fees, fixing leaky roofs. They use it to pay down debt or start small businesses. If anything, the security of a small guaranteed income often empowers them to take more risks and work harder. This evidence has sparked surging interest in universal basic income, or UBI. In developing countries, where governments struggle to deliver services and millions live on the edge of destitution, a small, universal, ultra-basic income could be revolutionary for reducing waste and unleashing human potential. But in a rich country like the United States, the authors argue UBI isn't the answer, not because people would get lazy, but because it misses the fundamental problem. The crisis we face isn't just about income. It's about dignity. People don't just want cash. They want to contribute. They want to be valued. Work, for many of us, is a source of identity, community, and self-respect. A society where a small elite does all meaningful work, while everyone else is paid to stay home and play video games, is dystopian. It's the world of Kurt Vonnegut's Player Piano, and it's a recipe for despair. So, what's the alternative? The authors propose radically rethinking social policy, built on the principle of care and respect. First, we need to move beyond the idea that the only solution for a lost job is for the worker to move. For older workers or those deeply rooted in their communities, we should subsidize them to stay in place, preserving the social fabric of towns and cities, just as Europe subsidizes farmers to preserve its countryside. Second, instead of just handing out cash, we need to invest massively in creating good jobs in sectors society desperately needs. Caring for our children and elderly isn't something that can be fully automated. The human touch will always be essential. We could create millions of well-paid, respected, meaningful jobs in early childhood education, elder care, and community health. It's not about government make-work jobs. It's about funding the essential work of a caring society. Finally, and most importantly, every interaction with the social safety net must be built on dignity. The authors tell the powerful story of an organization in France called ATD Fourth World, which runs a small business providing permanent jobs to people who've been homeless or faced extreme poverty. Their slogan is, "All together in dignity." They recognized that what the poor need most isn't another handout, but to be taken seriously as thinking, contributing human beings. Their goal is restoring the agency and self-respect that years of exclusion have stripped away. This is the essence of good economics. It's not a set of iron laws dooming us to inequality and division. It's a tool for building a world where markets serve human needs, not the other way around. It recognizes that growth is a means, not an end. The ultimate goal is improving quality of life for everyone, especially the most vulnerable. And that quality of life is about more than consumption. It's about health, education, having a voice, and above all, living a life of dignity. Good Economics for Hard Times isn't a book offering easy answers. It's a book teaching you to ask the right questions. Its most powerful lesson, for me, is beautifully simple, yet profound. The world is sticky. Our lives aren't a fluid, frictionless marketplace. We're attached to our homes, families, and identities. We're shaped by history, norms, and the stories we tell ourselves. Any economic policy, ignoring this fundamental human truth, is destined to cause more harm than good. For decades, we've been gripped by a certain kind of bad economics, an economics of simple models and arrogant pronouncements, promising the magic of markets would solve everything. It told us to cut taxes on the rich, embrace the creative destruction of trade without a second thought, and view the poor with suspicion. That economics failed. It didn't deliver promised growth, and it left us with soaring inequality, social fragmentation, and deep, simmering anger. Banerjee and Duflo offer an alternative: good economics. Good economics is humble. It admits what it doesn't know. It recognizes economists are more like plumbers than physicists, fixing problems one by one with a combination of science, intuition, and trial and error. Good economics is empirical. It doesn't rely on abstract theories. It goes into the world and tests ideas patiently and rigorously to see what actually works. But, most of all, good economics is humane. It never forgets that behind charts and equations are real people with hopes, fears, and a deep, universal need for dignity. It understands a job is more than a paycheck, a community is more than a collection of houses, and a good life is about more than material consumption. So how can we apply these lessons in our own lives? First, we can practice intellectual humility. The next time you hear a simple, confident claim about the economy on the news, whether about immigration, taxes, or trade, pause and ask yourself, what is this story leaving out? Who are the unseen people affected by this policy? What are the sticky realities the simple model ignores? Resisting the seduction of the obvious is the first step toward better thinking. Second, we can focus on what actually works. Instead of getting lost in grand ideological battles, we can support patient, evidence-based work, finding solutions that make real differences in people's lives. Whether it's a well-designed preschool program, effective job training, or a simpler way for families to access benefits they're entitled to. Progress isn't made in one giant leap, but in thousands of small, careful steps. Finally, we can lead with respect. The book's most enduring message is that social policy must start from a place of dignity. Whether we're talking about a laid-off factory worker, a struggling single mother, or an immigrant fleeing violence, we must see them not as problems to be solved, but as human beings with agency, aspirations, and something to contribute. That was a summary of Good Economics for Hard Times by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. We've covered a lot of ground today, but this is one of those books where a summary only scratches the surface. The real power lies in the details, the fascinating stories from around the world, the clever experiments, and the deep humanity shining through on every page. This summary is your map, but the treasure is in the book itself. If any of these ideas sparked your curiosity, I can't recommend it enough. It's not just a book about economics. It's a guide to understanding the world we live in and a source of hope for how we can make it better. A link to the book is in the description. If you found value in this journey today, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We're building a community of curious minds here, exploring ideas that can help us grow, and I'd be honored if you'd join us. Let's keep learning together.